And we are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Iowa Power BI user group. My name is James Bartlett. I'm here with Andrew Sitz and Nar Windenberger. Nar is going to be our presenter this evening. I'm going to go ahead and let Andrew, did you want to introduce yourself? Nar, you want to introduce yourself?
Go ahead,
Yeah,
Andrew. I'll introduce myself in the presentation.
sure.
Cool.
Yeah, so I'm Andrew Sitz. I'm a solutions architect with Lovelytics, which is a Databricks and cloud partner. So kind of just continue to be excited about the diversity of perspective we have in the group here. And I'm joined with a couple guys that have been here for, it's around coming in on 5 years now. So really excited about this.
And I'm a senior business intelligence analyst with Des Moines University. And Andrew and I are co-hosts or co-organizers of the Power BI, the Iowa Power BI user group. And we also want to give a quick little shout out to Mike Carlo for helping us run this session. He's there. He is, the man behind the curtain.
I'm behind the curtain here, so just hello.
Thanks, Mike. All right, I guess we'll turn everything over to Nar. Nar, take it away.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for the introduction. So my name is Nar Windenberger, and we are going to be talking about how to automatically test your Power BI report. All right, so imagine the following scenario. It's a Friday, it's 4 p.m. You just put the finishing touches on your PBIX file with that brand new customer churn analysis that your boss asked you for. You hit publish in Power BI, and it's a success. You feel energetic, enthusiastic, and proud as you compose that email to your boss and hit send, letting them know that it's been published. Now, the sun's shining, and you're about to sign off. You're looking forward to a weekend of relaxation where you'll enjoy a game of tennis, or maybe you finally gotten the kids out of the house and you can enjoy that date with your spouse. Or maybe you just want to kick back and enjoy the Super Bowl. Well, that was last weekend, but you get the idea. So as the clock strikes 4:45 p.m., you see an email from your boss, and they write, "Great job on the report. By the way, why are the sales figures from 2022 about 10% higher than they were yesterday? Something is looking off." And your heart sinks as you reply, "Shoot, I did a quick scan of the numbers before publishing, but I didn't even notice that discrepancy." And just as quickly as you type and hit the send button, your boss's reply comes right back, and they say, "Yeah, I've got a board presentation on Monday at 9 a.m. If you could come in on Saturday and fix it, that would be great." So if this has ever applied to you, you are in the right place for today's presentation. Now, if you're like me, when you're creating a Power BI report, the first time you are creating the visuals, setting up the model, writing the measures, and testing your formulas, you're like Obama before he took office. Now, when you're on the 10th or 15th iteration and you're retesting the same measures and same calculations in your report, you get pretty worn out. At least I do. So if you face any of the following problems, like you want to avoid brain rot from testing the same stuff over and over again, or as the complexity of your model and report increases, you get increasingly worried that something's going to break, or if you just face the developer's paradox, so you start telling your manager, "Oh, I wouldn't add that new feature, it's just too complex," when in reality, you're just worried that you're going to break something when you add it. Well, if any of those things apply, you're in the right place for today. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Naranth Windenberger, or NAR for short, and I am a principal consultant at P3 Adaptive. So I've been there for about 5.5 years now, and we like to say that we bring the human element to data projects, and we believe we can do any data projects much more cost effectively and faster than you've seen before. So that is where I've been working. I've enjoyed working as a consultant and trainer there. Had a chance to consult with a large array of companies, including more than 10 Fortune 500 companies. And I've got a business background, so I have an MBA, but really shifted over into the data analytics space as I found this to be the perfect intersection of business, logic, analytics. So I've really enjoyed it. And I have a couple certifications from Microsoft. I've got the Power BI certification and Microsoft Excel certification. And of course, I love to give back and present at these Power BI user groups, as well as I've written a few articles over the years talking about Power BI techniques and tips. Now, just for fun, a few of the things I like to do outside of work, I enjoy financial market analysis, weightlifting, gotten into chess recently, so that's been a lot of fun for me, and a little bit of salsa dancing on the side. Keep the left brain and right brain balanced there. All right, so before we jump into the presentation, I want to just talk about a few terms that we might cover. So for example, CICD, that's something that you all may have heard about. CICD stands for continuous integration, continuous development, and it's essentially a process for automating when you move your software project or whatever development work you're doing from maybe your test environment to your dev environment to your test environment, from your test environment to your production environment. And the idea is that you have these tasks that you have to do between each environment to replicate whatever you've created in your dev and move it to test, like duplicating your virtual machine, moving your database schema changes, pushing your code base changes. And then, of course, there's a little monster of testing. And you know what is testing anyway? Well, you may have heard this old joke. So a software tester walks into a bar and he orders a beer, then he orders 0 beer, then he orders 32,769 beers. And you kind of get the idea. Tester is trying to break the system and make sure that the result of their software, or in our case, our Power BI report, is producing results that make sense. Now, there are a variety of different test types, and we're not going to touch on every single one of them. But just to give everyone a sense of what we're talking about, you have unit testing, you have integration testing, acceptance testing, and regression testing. So just for a quick example of each one, unit testing is really where you test an individual component of your software or your report. And the analogy I like to use is in a car, you have all these different components. You have your engine, your transmission, you have your alternator, you have the wheels. Each component could be tested individually as a unit. So for example, your alternator, it generates electricity, and it takes an input, which is rotation of the input pulley, and it has an output, which is electricity of certain voltage and certain current and amperage. And so you can test that alternator separate of the whole car by putting a certain input and making sure you get the right output. So that's kind of the unit testing side. Integration testing would be more of how do you bring all those components together and make sure they work together and that the car runs. Acceptance testing would be having a driver get in the car and drive it and make sure that they are happy with that experience. And then regression testing, which is going to be the focus of our talk today, is going to be how do you prevent features that you've created in the past from breaking when you add new ones. So how do you prevent regressions from happening? And so CICD, it's really a methodology that has become the industry standard in big companies like Amazon, Netflix, Google, all the big tech companies. And it's been tough to apply that to Power BI. It's becoming more of a well-known process at this point with new tools, but it's still, for testing, it's not particularly feasible or easy at this point. And that's what we're going to be looking into. How can, as citizen developers, how can we automate our testing of our Power BI reports to prevent regressions? So what are your options? Well, number one is you can test everything manually before you would do a release of a new Power BI report, or when you release a new version of it. but that's no good. I mean, you don't want to prematurely age, obviously. You can wait for your CEO to tell you your report is wrong, which without saying is probably not going to be the best idea. Or you can automate your tests. So that's what we're going to focus on. Let's jump right into a demo. Just kidding. I want to just acknowledge a few folks who helped me develop this presentation and really contributed some ideas to the content we're going to see. So my colleague, Jarrett Medlin, he's a principal consultant also at P3 Adaptive, great guy. And then this guy named Alexander, who commented on a blog post I wrote a few years back where I laid out some of the concepts we're going to cover here on automated testing. He had a good idea that inspired some changes that I'm going to present today. And finally, demo, but just kidding. Let's talk about what are our goals in this presentation? Well, I want this to be something that anybody can apply, so you don't need to be a hardcore developer to be able to apply this. So yeah, you should, if you have Power BI and you can publish reports, you'll be able to do these techniques. And I want it to be out of the box, so you're really using Power BI's capabilities and not too many external tools or plugins that cost money. And I want to be able to send out alerts when any tests that we create, either they return an incorrect result, which means we need to investigate. So have a way to be alerted when things go wrong. And what you'll need is Power BI. So this is what we're going to look at is going to work on free, on pro, or premium. And you need an installation of Dax Studio, which is a free tool that plugs right into Power BI. And then, of course, you need some creativity and some discipline as you are building your reports to essentially save the results of your manual validation and really automate that for the future. So I hope that this gets you guys excited. Let's go ahead and jump in to our main demo for the evening here. All right, so the way that I like to start off is I'm going to show you where we're going to end up. All right, so we've got our good old Contoso Microsoft sample data set here. I've put together a pretty simple dashboard. It's a sales dashboard, so we can see we have a few visuals. We've got our top products by sales amount for the current year that we have selected. We have sales broken out by period. We've got product count and store counts across the different months, so we can track how many products are being sold. And down here in the bottom right, we have a little bit of a more complex metric, which is our sales per store per day. So if any of you have done retail work, you'll be familiar with a normalized metric, sales per store per week, or sales per store per day. Now, this is your typical, nothing too special about this dashboard, but what I have here is a tests page. And here we have a variety of automatic tests which compare known values that we have manually verified, and we have a nice little control view to have all the tests that we've written for our dashboard, are they passing? So this is what we're going to build in the next 45 minutes or so. I'm going to build through this step by step so that you all have an idea how to go about this. All right, so I'm going to get out of this end view. And we are going to start by doing our very first manual test. So we're going to do a manual test, and then we are going to automate it so that we don't have to do that validation ever again. So what do I want to validate? I'm going to confirm that this number here, so our sales for Q2 of 2009, and you can appreciate how old this data set is, 14 years at this point. So I'm going to validate that that number is actually that 674 million. And so this already takes a little bit of practice. If if you've taken if you're proficient in Power BI, you've probably had some practice going into the raw source data and validating. So if I wanted to actually, and I'll just show you guys the model here, pretty simple star schema where we have our lookup tables and our common fact table, our sales table. So to validate that particular data point, I'm going to go to the sales table and pull up the records, the rows for that year and quarter, and just basically do a sum of my sales amount to see what the value is. So I have my sales table pulled up, and I've added a temporary column here just to look up that quarter, and I'm going to select Q2 of 2009. And now we have a filtered version of sales that shows just our sales amount for that quarter and year. Now, what I would do at this point is I would pull up Excel. And again, this is the manual validation part. So I would pull up Excel and I would copy that information into Excel. So if you look here, I have 153,000 rows copied here. I've already copied it in just to save a little bit of time for the demo here. And if I do a sum of that sales amount, we can see that we get that $674 million worth of sales for that period. So this is your basic manual test. Now that we know that the correct, accurate value for that quarter and year is that 674 million, we now can save this and create an automated test. So how do we do that? Well, we're going to look at three different ways. The first way is going to be in Dax Studio. And if you haven't used Dax Studio, this is a tool you can get from daxstudio.org. You can download it, and when you install it, it actually goes into your external tools up here as an option that you can pull up directly from Power BI. So I already have Dax Studio opened here, and I'm not going to be able to go into the details of how to use Dax Studio. That would be another topic. But the idea is that you do have to connect to the file that you have open. So I'm going to connect to that Power BI file that I'm looking at. And now you can write a DAX query. The difference between Dax Studio and Power BI is that when you write a measure in Power BI, measures always return scalar values, but in Dax Studio, you have to write formulas or expressions that return a table. So you begin every expression with evaluate, and we're going to write our first test. So I'm going to start that off by using the row function, and the row function is real simple. You can put in the name of a column, and then you can put in a value. So I'm going to create a single row table with one column called test name. All right. And I'm going to run this, I'm going to hit F5 just to run it so y'all can see what happens. So we get a one row table that has test name. Nothing special so far. Now I'm going to add another row called expected value. This is where we start to build out our test. So I'm going to plug in the number that I manually validated, which is that 674 million. And that is the expected value for this particular test. Now I'm going to add another column. Actually, before I do that, let me hit run. I hit F5, run. And now we have a two column, one row table. We've got the test name and we have that expected value, all hard coded so far. So here's where we now bring in the actual value. This is the value that the model is going to calculate for us using the particular filter context that we care about. So I'm going to do a calculate, and I'm glad that I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name, the guy who hates calculate. I hope he's not on the the call today because this would probably disappoint him. But I'm going to do calculate sales amount. Is it I won't say any names. I'm going to.
I know the name. I'll throw the name. The name is Greg Deckler. Greg Deckler. Calling all Greg Decklers on the internet. This one's for you. We're shouting at you, the guy who hates calculate. So I'll throw that in there to make sure we get him in there.
All right. It's on you. It's on you now. It's been all over LinkedIn, so I just had to call that out. All right, so we're going to calculate our measure with a particular filter context defined. In this case, I'm going to calculate my sales amount for the calendar year equal to 2009. We zoom out a bit here, and the calendar quarter label is equal to Q2. So in other words, that is as though we are replicating the filter context for this particular data point on the visual. And when I run that now, I hit F5 again to run it. We now have a third column which shows us our expected value. I'm going to add a fourth column, which is allowed variance percentage. Because when you create a test, sometimes you can expect minor variances. Maybe somebody made an accounting adjustment to a transaction and it was such a small amount that you don't want your test to fail if you have a tiny minute fluctuation. So we're going to put in a variance and allow 0.001, which is 0.1%. Okay, so this is the basic setup for the test, for a single test. And now we want to actually compare to see if the actual value equals the expected value. So to do that, I'm going to use add columns. Now, if you're unfamiliar with some of these Dax functions, I would say this is being recorded. You can come back, review the live stream, and you can see the formulas we've used. So I'm going to do an add columns, which is going to allow me to add additional columns to this table, and I can reference calculated values from within the inner table. So I'm going to add column called, let's say, variance percentage. So this is the actual variance percentage. And the way I would do that is I'm going to divide my actual value. And notice that now I can reference a column from inside the inner table, and I'm going to divide it by my expected value. Good. So let me close out the add columns just to show this what happens. I now have a variance percentage, which is 100%. So in fact, I want to do 1 minus that so that I get a variance off of a basis of 0. And you can see that my variance is 0%. Now, sometimes you might get a positive variance, sometimes you might get a negative variance. So to account for that, I like to do an absolute value around there. And now, even if it's a positive or negative variance, we will be in good shape. And then finally, we would have our final column which is test passed. So our test passes if the variance percentage is less than the allowed variance percentage. So since we know this is the variance percentage, I can say if that is less than or equal to allowed variance percentage, if that's the case, then then we would get a pass. So we now have our first fully automated test. Notice that the actual value is what drives the variance percentage, and then we get a test passed or failed. All right, so that is our first basic automated test. And you might be thinking, well, all right, what's so special about automating a basic sum formula? But we're going to now create a couple of additional tests here and start to basically flesh out our automated testing suite. All right. So that would be our first one, and let's add a second one. So how do you bring in a second test? Well, we can use a union. So if you've ever used SQL, you have this union function, which allows you to combine multiple tables into one table. So I have this row is a one row table. I'm going to duplicate that. And now I have two rows that are being unioned with the union function. So I have test1, test2. And when I run this, so if I run or hit F5, I now have a second test. Now it's just a matter of going in and changing the test name and all the expected values. So for my second test, we are going to add one called July 2009 store count. And I'm going to spare you the details of all the validation I've done. But if we come back here, let's just assume that I've validated the store count is 305 for July 2009. So essentially, to generate the filter context, you have to look at your visual and figure out what filters are affecting it. And you also look at the visual's evaluation context. So in this case, we have years 2009, and we have month is July. So you have to input those into your automated test, into your filter context. So I'm going to say my measure, calculate my store count measure for calendar year equals 2009. And then the name of the column for the month is calendar month label. So I can just copy that in and use that calendar month label equals July. Good. And I'm going to say my allowed variance here is 0, because if we went missing a store, that would be a big problem. So I don't want, the number should always be 305. We had 305 stores active in that year and month. No questions, no ifs, buts, or whens. And so that second test is now configured, and it also passes. So I'm going to add a third test just to give you all an example. And this one is going to be for that more complicated measure. So this is going to be my Q1 2009 Ireland SPSPD, so sales per store per day. And for this one, how do I know for sure? So let me, if I pick Ireland as in my country here, and if we look at my formula here for SPSPD, just to set the stage here, this is a little bit more complex because we're dividing our sales amount into this denominator. And this essentially, the denominator is the count of unique day store product combinations. So that's a little bit more complex. If we look at the denominator measure, there's a little bit more going on here. And I'm not going to go into those details for the purpose of this presentation, but you've got like a summarize function and a sumx. So some funky stuff, and it's not as easy to validate whether the number that we're seeing here is accurate. So when you're validating a more complex measure like that, this is where it becomes helpful to step-by-step walk through the logic of validating it. So if I were to manually validate, let me just run through that process. And this is probably an exercise you all have done for your own reports. But I would copy the raw data from the model into an Excel sheet generally, and I would just make sure that the business logic that I'm thinking through matches what the measure is supposed to do. So what I've done is I created this audit page. And this audit page, since I know that my measure to calculate that denominator, that that divisor, I need to know what my sales amount was for each date, product, and store key. So I created a table visual, and I put on, I made it to be the granularity of date, product, and store key, and then I can just export that to Excel and do my validation. So if I were to export that, you would get something like this. I would copy it over into here, and now I can calculate the two pieces of my measure. So my measure had a sales amount and it had a denominator. And again, I'm just thinking from a business logic perspective here. I'm thinking as the business as a business user, I'm trying to understand how this metric is calculated. Sales amount is simply just the sum of all the sales in that filter context. Now, my denominator would be the unique count of combinations of product, store, and date, because those are the like sales per store per day is normalized for unique combinations of date, product, and store. In other words, it would be the row count of this data set that I have broken out by date, product, and store. Anyway, probably more detail than you guys care about, but the idea is that I'm doing a count here and I have this manually validated in this Excel sheet. My sales per store per day becomes sales divided by denominator, and I now have this saved here as a manual test for future reference that I can refer back to. So my sales per store per day, the value that I have calculated manually is at 39.29. So I'm going to enter that in here, 39.29.6. And in this case, my test would be calculate my sales per store per day for the year equals 2009. We're going to bring in the calendar quarter, it's Q1, and the country, which is the region country name. So you just copy the filter context, region country name is equal to Ireland. And again, I'm going to give this a little bit of a variance just so we don't get a bunch of false positives. So I'll give it up to a 0.01% allowed variance. And now I hit run again. And you can see that Power BI calculates the measure for that filter context, and we get exactly the same value. So test passes. So you can see now, as you are building your model and you're doing your manual validation, if you take this extra time to just save the results of your test, you now are doing that heavy lifting one time, and now you're learning how you can leverage it down the road. So when we're done with this, you're going to see how powerful this is with an example of actually breaking something in the model and seeing those tests starting to fail. All right. So that's the first way that we can create automated tests. You can write a script in Dax Studio, a Dax query, but it's not quite as user friendly as as we can get. It would be nice if we could have this test suite in Power BI so that we can just, every time we make some changes, we can go and check, do all the tests pass, or maybe something breaks and we have to go investigate. So that's what we're going to look at next. To prep this, we need to move this table that we have here in Dax Studio. We're going to move that and create a little bit of a template in Excel. So in this sheet where I've had the manual tests, I have this tab here called test list. And this is something you need to set up one time, but then you can essentially add additional tests to this sheet, and it's going to get loaded into Power BI and then execute automatically after that point. So I'm going to have a test ID, just a 1, 2, 3, 4, number, test name, and then we can add some cool things. So we can add a category. Is this a base measure test? Is it a sales per store per day test? We can come up with whatever categorization we want. We can add a priority. Is it high, medium, or low? Maybe if it's a low priority test and it fails before we're about to publish, well, we can just ignore that. Maybe it's not big enough deal to worry about. So you can think through that, and then you put in your expected value and allowed variance and your DAX code. So this would be essentially what we've written in Dax Studio. So you would bring in your test name, you would bring in the expected value, and I'm going to, for time purposes, I'm going to just copy a few of these tests. Well, we can start with one here, and I'll copy that in here. And so you can see that it's that first one that I did in Dax Studio. and I have the Dax code, which I copied, and the expected value. So this is the template that you would use. And then you're going to load that into your Power BI file. So coming back to the Power BI file, if I go into transform data, you'll notice that I already have this file called test list loaded in. And let me make sure I save before I refresh. So again, we're not going to go into the Power Query, but it's a pretty simple load into Power BI of an Excel sheet. And now when I load that in, I have my test list table here, just a disconnected table. I'm not going to relate it to anything in the model. So from that, we can now go to our tests page. And I've created a bit of a template here. So we saw what the final product looks like. We're going to build that out together just so you can see step by step. I'm going to start by populating the table that's going to show all of our tests. This one here, it's just a table visual. And I'm working off the assumption that the viewers on this live stream, you've worked in Power BI before, so I'm going a little bit fast on some of the details. I'm going to bring in my test ID. I'm going to bring in the test name and a few other columns here, like the category, the priority, the allowed variance percentage, and then the expected value. So now I'm starting to pull in the parameters for the test, and now I have to create my first measure, which is going to be a calculated actual value. So similar to what we did in Dax Studio, to actually have it automatically calculate the value and compare it to the test. So for the actual value, I'm going to create a measure, and this is where we're going to tell Power BI, for this specific test ID, what should the what should the actual value be for that particular test? So this is going to be called test measure actual value. I'm going to use our friend, the switch function, and we're going to switch over the selected value of our test list, test ID. And now we can go through one by one. If the test ID is 1, we want to evaluate the following DAX. I'm going to copy my DAX code and plug that in here. So let's pause here. I'm going to run this measure and actually bring it into the visual. So I'm going to bring that into the table visual. And you can see that if you've used Switch before, this should be pretty intuitive, but Switch looks at the value in your filter, in your visuals filter context. And since the test ID is 1 here, it executes that calculate statement, which is the actual value for this particular test. And if we have additional tests now, we can simply add additional values to this formula. I'm going to go ahead and add that. But hey, James, are there any urgent questions or thoughts that have come through, or should I keep going?
I'm monitoring the LinkedIn stream right now, and we had only one question earlier, which was, what does CICD stand for? And I already answered that one. So,
all right, sounds good.
Do we have?
All right, so we are going to copy in a few more tests into our test list, and I've already prepared these ahead of time. So this would be something you would do as you're developing your report. And I'm going to copy in 4 additional tests, 3 of which we've already seen in Dax Studio. And I'm going to save. So I save my spreadsheet. And then I can refresh here in Power BI. So there's only a few steps you have to do. I'm going to refresh my test list. And when I do that, you'll notice that we now have 4 tests in here, but the measure actual value is only returning for one of them. So this is where I would copy in the expressions from each test. And we're going to see a simpler way to do this, so bear with me for right now. This is sort of the poor man's version, but we're gonna see even a way to automate this part. You can see I've copied in the specific automated test for each test ID, and now we should be, if I close this out, we now get an actual value for each test because, oh, and my test ID is having a problem because I need to set that from a count to don't summarize. There we go. So test ID 1, 2, 3, 4, the switch statement reads the test ID that it's evaluating the measure at, and we get a different actual value for each one. All right, so that's how we get our actual value. And from this point, it's just an exercise of bringing in the additional columns, and I'm going to create those as measures so that we can get a complete, test suite in Power BI. So I will create one additional measure, which is going to be called the test actual variance. So let me pull this up. Test actual variance percentage. And this is going to be the same, essentially the same logic that we did in Dax Studio. We're going to divide the actual value by the expected value, subtract that from 1, and then just take the absolute value so that we don't have to worry about positive or negative variance. It'll all get rolled in. So I can actually copy that code in here. And I need to replace these with the actual measures now. Now we are referencing the measures in our model instead of the calculated column in the Dax Studio function. So test measure actual value, and the expected value is going to be, this is not a measure, this is pulling from our test list, which is our expected value. So the selected value of our test list, again, this is just a hard-coded value coming in from our spreadsheet, which is, sorry, this one right here. So if I've done that correctly, we now have a variance. So I'm going to put in, I'm just going to rename these to shrink the widths down a little bit. And then we have actual var percentage. And I'll make that a percentage. And make that, just format that a little bit. And you can see we're getting 0 variance. All right, come on, zoom it. It's acting up on me here. Look at that, that's beautiful. So we are getting 0 variance on each test. So everything's looking good. And then finally, we'll create our test passed measure. And this is going to tell us 1 or 0. And we'll say if the test actual variance is less than or equal to the selected value of our test list allowed variance. So this is, again, comparing the actual variance to the allowed variance. If we get that, if that's true, we're going to return a 1, otherwise return a 0. So this is going to give us a quick 1, 0 true false indicator whether the test passed. And we can see that each test has passed, so we are good. And if I want to see a total, because we could get up to a number of tests. I've actually tested this approach to get around to 200 to 250 individual tests if you wanted to. So you can get a pretty robust set of tests in here. And I want to see what my totals are here. And Mike, I have another Greg Deckler reference here, because sure enough, it looks like our totals are not adding up here. And so we're
I
gonna.
dig it. We've already
I
tagged
can't-
him on the internet on Twitter, so hopefully he'll eventually show up here. We tagged him saying, Greg Dickler, you're getting called out.
I mean,
He's not wrong. He's not wrong here. I think this makes sense. Like, I get it.
Well, in this case, it does make sense for this visual, but in a second, we'll need it to, we'll have to use the sum x pattern that, if you all have been following that debate, there is this this debate. Why don't our totals add up to the sum of the columns? And when you have a little more experience in Power BI, it makes sense. But as a newer user, it's sometimes a little bit counterintuitive. So the pattern that we use here is just a pattern that you can apply, but you do a sum x to iterate over each test, and for each test you calculate, did the test pass, and if so, return a 1 or a 0. And the formula changes slightly. So again, use this as a pattern. This isn't meant to be a DAX session, but this is going to make our totals add up so that we can see how many tests have passed. And again, come back to the session. It's being recorded. You can copy the code. And now you can see when it iterates test by test, it doesn't really make sense at the total level. You wouldn't know if a test is passed because you have to check it each test one at a time. And so we see that all 4 tests passed. And the reason I'm creating that total test pass measure is now we actually unlock the ability to calculate what percentage of tests have passed. So for this next visual over on the left here, we're going to calculate how many tests did we have, how many passed, and what percentage have passed. So that'll be our last measure, and then we can bring this all together into an awesome testing suite. So test passed percentage. Well, I first need a variable, or I need to calculate how many total tests do we have. And that is going to be a count rows of our test list. Simple count, that spreadsheet. If there's 4 rows, we have 4 tests. And then we have a variable for tests passed. And that is going to be our measure from over here, test passed. And then we will simply divide the 2. So we'll return dividing our tests passed into our total tests. And if I have the variable, let's actually refer to that. And so with that, we can bring that measure into our card visual over on the left. And what do you know? It's totally blank because I need to apply now some conditional formatting to make this really pop. I made the text white already. I was trying to eliminate the maximum number of additional steps for the demo. So this is where you can make this pretty awesome. This is where your creativity can come into play. I'm going to make the background color on this visual change from green if we're at 100%, or if we're below 100, it'll be a cautionary color. So under our visual settings, we can go to general, we can go to background, and we can do a dynamic background color. And I'm going to make this based off of the field test passed percentage. And basically, if you can see I had this already preset, I've done this earlier. If our value is greater than or equal to 1, which is 100%, and less than some arbitrary number, I just had to plug in a number there, then we return a green color. And then conversely, if the test passed percentage is between 0 and 1, we can return that orange, which is more of a cautionary color. So go ahead and apply that. And now we get that nice color. And let me change the format so it'll be a percentage on the test pass percentage. Awesome. So you can see, guys, this is already starting to shape up. We are now building out this test suite. We're going to add some conditional formatting over here as well so that we can easily see which test has failed and which one has passed. And you're going to see in just a moment how it all comes together. So I'm going to add conditional formatting on that test passed column. Whoops, we need to do rules. If it's greater than or equal to 1 and less than some absurd number, we do green. And if it's greater than 0 and less than 1, then we do, I'm using that orange. And now we have that conditional formatting over here. And then I took this a little further. I thought, you know, if you have a category and you have your high, medium, and low priority, well, let's drop in our test passed percentage into this visual, this matrix, and we'll make this pop out a little bit. So now we can see that we're 100% on all of these. Let's just throw in that same conditional formatting like we've done. I'm going to go and put in a background color, and we'll do the same rules, just all the same rules on each one. If it's greater than 1, less than the high number, we do green. And if it's greater than zero but less than 1, we do that orange. All right, guys. So I don't know, if you ask me, I think this is really easy representation now to dig in and see. You can click on a cell, you can filter down to the particular tests and see the details.
This is fantastic, Nar. I'm just blown away.
Who do we got there? Oh, is that James?
Sorry, that was me. Yes.
Oh, your voice changed for a second, but thank
Yeah,
you.
I had a little frog in my throat there. I had to clear it. Sorry.
All right. So that's the second way that you can that you can set up this automated test suite. We've done the Dax Studio approach, a little bit more manual, and now we're looking at doing it in Power BI, setting up this visual. Now you might be thinking, hey, it's kind of annoying to have to go and maintain your switch statement, because every time you change something in the Excel sheet, now you have to go and make sure you have it synced with this. So I was thinking about this. How can we make this a little bit easier? And I wrote up a measure here. Again, this is too detailed to go into the explanation in such a short presentation, but we're going to create a measure that generates this DAX code for us. It's going to generate all of this so that all we have to do is copy and paste, and we have a simple 3-step process to maintain our automated tests. We add a new test to our spreadsheet, we refresh the test list in Power BI, and then finally, we just copy the DAX code into here, and we are good to go. So to show you that, I'm going to create a new measure, and I'll copy in some code that I've prepared. And the idea is that this code, it outputs text, which is going to give us the text for the measure. So it's like a meta measure, so to speak. And I'm not going to go into the depth of it, but I will pull up a slide here. So for anybody who wants to come back and look at this to see the explanation, you can see that the yellow highlighting of the DAX measure shows you what you get as output. So come back to this slide if you are interested, and we'll try and also get the presentation materials published so you can see this later. This measure here outputs text, and a couple things I'll call out is that I'm inserting some line breaks and some tabs. So it also formats the measure text for you, and it uses a concatenate X to iterate through each test and basically take your DAX code for each test and roll it into a measure string that you can then copy and paste. I'm going to take that, and just for convenience, I'm going to put that measure into this table visual just to show that text there. And you'll see here that the result of that measure is actually text, and it looks like DAX code, and that's what it's intended to be. So I can copy that DAX code, and I can now replace the DAX for my switch statement. I can paste it. Notice that it returned the exact same thing because it's taking it's taking the DAX code from our spreadsheet, which is the source, and it's just formatting it and giving us a nice switch statement. All right. So now let's test this out. Let's see if it actually works in practice, right? So I have a few more automated tests that I've prepared. I'm going to copy these in. So let's imagine you're creating your report and you've done some manual validation, and now you have your test list here, nice and ready to go. You hit save. So that's step one. You refresh your test list table. That's step two. Takes a second, and boom, now you've got your 9 tests in here, but you have to still do test step 3, which is to update your actual value measure so that you get an actual value for each test. And because we created that DAX code measure for us, we will copy that value, paste it in here, and now we have 9 tests loaded into our measure. And when I hit enter there, you can see that our actual value is now calculating. And if I shrink this down a little bit, we can see that every single test has passed. All 9 tests have passed. 100%. We are good to go. So you might be thinking, all right, this is great. Well, let's have the rubber meet the road, so to speak. And right now, all the tests are passed because we haven't screwed with our model. But here could be a scenario that might be certainly common. I'm going to merge in some new data into my sales table. So I'm going to bring in this sales rep key. It's like, who was the sales rep for a particular sale? And this is at the grain of store and product. I'm going to merge that into the sales table so that I have that ID on there to analyze. So I would do a merge here and bring in my sales rep table. And again, this is more of an example. So if you haven't, you can come back and watch this in more detail, but I'm going through it a little bit quickly. But I'm going to merge in the sales rep key into my sales table using the store key and product key as the merge columns. And then I'm going to expand that value out. This is just a little demo. So I expand the sales rep key. And we can see now that for each sale, based on whether the sales rep was the rep for that product or store, we get the sales rep key. And I'll just, replace values. Replace nulls with 0, or let's say a -1. So it's like an invalid key. So this is what the kind of change that I would consider pretty low risk. As I'm going to now load the data, it'll take a couple seconds to load. And, this is the kind of thing that you build your initial report, and then you get additional requests down the road, right? So, hey, can you bring in sales rep ID? You made such a great dashboard. Now we want to analyze it by sales rep ID. And this is the kind of thing that, I'm usually really worried about, because if I make some change to the model, maybe something's going to break and I won't know about it. So as this loads, this will be another few seconds here. We got about 2.8 million, so it should be pretty quick. What I recommend is when you have your automated tests set up, you just switch back to your test page on the fly. So before you make a major change, you check, hey, did all my tests pass? Then you make your change, and then you can come back to it afterwards, and you just flip to your test page, and you can see. So here we go. It should be done loading, and sure enough, 2 of our tests have failed. So I know that the reason in this case that it failed is because when we merged in that new table, it created some duplicate rows in our sales table. So I already knew that, and you won't always know what the cause is when you make something that breaks your model. But instead of just, flipping a coin and wishing for the best, you now can have a quick glance and see, okay, it looks like our total sales is off because our variance is 0.1. And so that must mean it's above the threshold. And same with the 2009 margin. So I think you all can see now the power of this. It brings your attention right away to changes that may have caused something to break. So real quick here, I know we're kind of coming up on time, but the very last piece that I wanted to show you all is the third way that you can automate your tests. So if you publish this report to Power BI, because you have this card visual here, you can actually use that to generate automatic alerts. And this is where it can get really powerful, because sometimes, if you're connecting to some source system or your source data changes, maybe that's you have an error in the ETL process, and now you have invalid data. This is a way you can see, even day by day, every day that your data refreshes, you can see if any of your tests fail and get an automatic alert. So the way you would do that, if you haven't done an alert before, is you pull up your dashboard in powerbi.com, and you can see I've already published it. And then you go to your visual and select that little pin icon. That allows you to pin that visual to a dashboard, and we'll call it tests dashboard. And once you have that visual pinned, you can now set up an alert on it. So again, all out of the box. You're not having any additional plugins here. And on that visual in your dashboard, you can go to this Manage Alerts page. And I'm going to go here, and I'm going to add an alert rule. So anytime that the value on this card drops below 1, which would be 100%, we are going to have it send an email to us. And just like that, guys, we now have 3 ways to set up automated tests. You've got Dax Studio, you have a Power BI report page, and now you have an automatic alert that's going to get sent right to your email if a test fails. So just to wrap up here, I know I've covered quite a bit, and I just want to bring this back to what's the whole point of this? Well, leverage Power BI to automate your tests. And that means that when you do manual validation, you write down what was the result that I calculated. You save the data that you use to generate your manual validation. Because, for example, when that test failed here, since I have the raw data in my spreadsheet, I can now compare. I could do that same process. I can export the sales for that quarter, bring them into Excel, and now I have somewhere to actually, a solid ground, some solid footing to start my comparison and see where the information went wrong. So leverage that, leverage the work you did manually testing. And I like to think of the 80-20 rule in this case. This isn't some, top of the line CICD testing automation suite, but you can get quite a bit done using out of the box tools. So you can get 80% of your testing, regression testing done with 20% of the effort. And, like I said, save those test cases when you create them. It takes a little bit of discipline, because as soon as you see that the number adds up, I usually just like to go on to the next thing I have to build. But if you take that time up front, you can save yourself a lot of time down the road. And then just check your test page often. Go back to that test page in Power BI and just make sure everything's green. And then that at least for the test cases you've done, that everything is going to be in good shape. Now, this isn't going to catch everything, and you're still going to get those times when some error slips by and somebody catches it, like the CEO. And when that happens, you can add that test case so that it won't happen in the future. So you'll quickly see what metrics are the most important to your end users. They're going to be the ones that you can add as test cases and have in your automated testing suite. So finally, just to talk a little bit about next steps, if you liked what you saw today, here are a few ideas for how you can take this a step further. So my colleague Jarrett, who I mentioned earlier, he actually came up with a PowerShell script to automate this and run against your model on a daily basis. It calls the Power BI APIs to execute those queries. So it's a little bit more technically in-depth, but something that you could do to fully automate that. And you could even create a job that saves the results of those tests every day and have a daily snapshot of how many tests passed or failed, and you can start to track trends. And then if you really go all out, you're working in an enterprise, well, this is where maybe setting up a full testing suite in a CI/CD pipeline is going to become appropriate. But again, those are all, they're not really out of the box. And so those are kind of level ups on this automated testing idea. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining this. I hope it was valuable for you and maybe gave you some new ideas. And I really enjoyed presenting to you all. Thank you to Mike for kind of doing all the technical work, setting this up, and James, really appreciate you hosting. And yeah, that's all I got. So thank you all, and I'll stick around for the water cooler chat at the end of this.
Absolutely. I'm gonna post the link to the happy hour in the chat here. So that's going in on YouTube, on LinkedIn. Hopefully, some of y'all will be able to join us. We're going to be basically hopping over to that. If there's anybody who has any questions before we do that, make sure that you get them in right now before we switch over.
Yeah, I'll stick around here.
Part of the recording.
Yeah, I'll stick around here for any questions.
All right, producer Mike popping in here from the background. I'm going to hop on over to the Microsoft Teams meeting. So it is a link that is inside the LinkedIn. There's a couple links flying around here. It is a bit.ly link, a very short link here. Feel free to hop in there. It's no recording. It's just hang out, talk with the presenter, talk with the user group, just kind of hang out and chill. And we'll hang around as long as people are willing to talk. So I'm going to pop off now. We're going to end the stream here in just a minute or so. I don't see any questions coming through right now.
We got one that just came in on YouTube, although I'm not
Perfect.
sure if it's related to the topic. It says, why are stored procedures important in Power BI? I don't know if that's really relevant to our topic for today, but certainly worth addressing.
What do you think, Andrew? You're doing some Databricks stuff, right?
Yeah. Well, for one,
put you on the spot.
Yeah, so for one, there's no such thing as a stored procedure in Databricks, so the shackles have been unlocked. So there is a concept of saved queries, but I actually think that is something that I want to cover. We had planned on having me present next month. I'd love to talk about using a different backend like Databricks. I do think if you are on a relational database, though, that if you can move, I know views are often recommended to pull data from, so you're not, moving a lot of logic downstream. There could be slightly differing viewpoints on that if you want to do all of your items in Power Query, but I tend to like to move things upstream more. So you can technically have the stored procedure as a part of a CI/CD pipeline and can integrate your testing on that base data more upstream. But I think that's an interesting question because it's about maybe a different type of testing than we covered here.
Yeah,
which is an
I would call that that's
by the
more
way.
like a data engineering test, like something that maybe the data engineering folks would want to perform in the data warehouse, make sure that the data has been properly ingested from its source system before it then moves on to Power BI. So obviously the CI/CD doesn't always have to be in one specific place, and I think that every development team needs to be doing its own testing to make sure that the changes that they're making are valid and that they're not introducing problems further downstream.
For sure.
All right. Well, thank you, everyone.
Yeah,
I think
good
we're going to
question,
hop
though.
over to the let's hop over to the happy hour, and hopefully we can see as many of you as possible over there and continue the conversation in a more kind of casual environment.
Yeah,
All right,
looking
guys.
forward to it.
See you in a
All
bit.
right.